61 years old, I carried a cardboard box out of the house I'd lived in for 19 years while my wife's younger brother stood in the kitchen doorway, eating a sandwich and watching me like I was moving furniture he hadn't decided where to put yet. It was a Wednesday in November, the kind of cold that gets into your knuckles before you realize it. I had $214 in my checking account, a 2009 Chevy Silverado with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and no plan beyond getting to the end of the driveway without saying something I couldn't take back. My name is Roy. No, my name is Clifford. My name is Owen Shea. I was 61 years old when my wife asked me to make room for her brother because he was going through a hard time. That was the phrase she used, a hard time. What it looked like in practice was this. He slept past 10, left dishes in the sink with dried egg on them, smoked on the back porch I'd built with pressure-treated lumber the summer before, and referred to me in my own home as the guy who lives here. My wife, Paulette, and I'd been married 11 years, second marriage for both of us. We weren't a fairy tale. We were two people in our 50s who had figured out how to share a refrigerator and a checking account and a life without too much friction. That counted for something. I believed that right up until the night she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, very carefully, that it might be better for everyone if I found somewhere to stay for a little while. Her brother Denny had moved in 4 months earlier after his second divorce finalized, and his landlord wouldn't renew his lease. The two things were probably connected. Paulette didn't say that, and I didn't push it. He was family. I understood that. What I didn't understand was when family became a reason to subtract me from the equation. The argument that night had started the same way the others started. Denny had used my tools without asking, a good torque wrench I'd had for 12 years, and left them on the driveway in the rain. I'd asked him as calmly as I could manage to put them back where he found them. He'd shrugged. Paulette had stepped in. He's adjusting, she said. He's 44, I said. Not 14. That was apparently the wrong response. An hour later, she came into the living room where I was watching the news and asked me to sit at the table. Denny was leaning against the counter behind her with his arms crossed, watching. I think some space would help, she said. Space for who? For everyone. Denny feels like you're always on edge around him. I looked past her at him. He had the same expression Brandon had in the video I'd watched once about a man losing his house. That look of someone who already knows how the meeting ends. Where would I go? I asked. She suggested a hotel. Just for a week or two, she said, until things settle. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't knock anything over. I went upstairs and pulled a cardboard box from the closet shelf and started filling it with the things that were only mine. My grandfather's pocket watch. My discharge papers from the Army, framed. A photo of my son from his college graduation 8 years ago. My work boots. 3 flannels. Paulette stood in the doorway at one point. This doesn't have to be a whole thing, she said. I kept folding. When I came downstairs, Denny had moved closer to the front door. He said, probably for the best, and said it like he was doing me a favor. I looked at him. 44 years old. Never held a mortgage. Never fixed a broken water heater in the middle of January. Never stayed up past midnight doing tax returns so someone else could sleep soundly. For whose best? I asked. He picked up his sandwich again. Paulette opened the front door. The cold air came through like a fact. I stepped out onto the porch and waited for half a second, the way you wait when you think someone might say something real. She didn't. I'll call you, she said. I walked to the truck. The engine turned over on the second try. The heater worked at least. I sat there in the driveway with my hands on the wheel and watched the porch light stay on while I backed out, then watched it in the rearview mirror all the way to the end of the block. 11 years. And I had become the inconvenience. I drove for a while without direction, past the hardware store on Route 9 where I knew which aisle had the copper fittings, past the diner where Paulette and I used to go after church. I ended up in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel off the highway. Not because I was hungry, but because the lot was lit, and I needed to stop moving. I reclined the seat and stared at the ceiling of the cab. I thought about calling my son Theo. He lived in Portland, Oregon. We talked every couple of weeks. Nothing more. I didn't call. It was late there and I didn't have a story yet, just a situation. I thought about calling my older sister June in Roanoke. Same problem. What would I say? Your little brother is sleeping in a Cracker Barrel parking lot at 61 because his wife's brother needed elbow room. I set the phone on the passenger seat and let the silence do what silence does. The first night I didn't really sleep. I drifted in and out of something shallow and cold. The heater worked fine, but I kept turning it off to save gas, and each time the cab cooled down faster than I expected. By 2 in the morning, I had memorized the parking lot layout and the way the highway overpass lights reflected off the hood of the truck. The next morning, I drove to the YMCA on Central Avenue. I had an old membership I'd kept out of habit. $15 a month, the kind of thing you forget to cancel. I showered, changed into the clothes from the box, and looked at myself in the locker room mirror for a long moment. 61 years old, retired from the county road department after 32 years. Not sick, not broke, not unkind, just unwanted in my own house. I went to work anyway. I've been doing part-time maintenance consulting for a small property management company since I retired. 2 or 3 days a week. I showed up, I fixed things, I didn't talk about any of it. That evening I moved to a different lot. A church parking lot on the edge of town. St. Ambrose. Quieter. Darker. Around midnight someone knocked on the passenger window. I rolled it down half wet. A woman in her late 60s stood there in a heavy coat, holding a flashlight. She introduced herself as Adele Marsh, the church's property volunteer. She'd seen the truck 2 nights running and wanted to make sure everything was all right. "Everything's fine," I said automatically. She looked at me with the kind of eyes that have heard fine from people who meant the opposite for 40 years. "You have somewhere to go?" she asked. "I have the truck," I said. She didn't sigh, didn't lecture. She went back inside and came out 5 minutes later with a thermos of coffee and a key on a ring with a small wooden cross. "Fellowship Hall side door," she said. "There's a couch in the storage room off the kitchen. Heat works. No one's in there before 7. I looked at the key. "You don't know me," I said. "I know enough," she said. "Go get some sleep." That kind of thing. A stranger with a key and no agenda hits you differently when you're 61 and you thought you'd seen everything. I slept on that couch for 2 nights. It smelled like old carpet and coffee and candle wax. It was the best sleep I'd gotten in weeks. On the 3rd day, before I could think too hard about it, I drove to the bank. I had my own individual savings account. Always had. Paulette had hers. We had a joint. And I moved enough into it to cover 3 months of expenses without touching the joint. That much I knew to do. I wasn't going to be locked out twice. The joint account I left alone. I wasn't going to be the one to weaponize money. But I was going to protect what was mine. That same afternoon, I called my son. He picked up on the second ring. I told him plainly. Not dramatically, just the sequence. His mother and I had been married 11 years, but this was my son from my first marriage, and he knew Paulette well enough to be polite and not much more. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dad, do you need money?" I said, "No." "Do you need a place to go?" There was a pause on my end. "I'm figuring it out," I said. He said, "You can come here. The offer's open." I said I knew. I thanked him. That was enough. 2 days later, I got a message from a man named Grady Polk. We'd worked together on county road crews for about 6 years in the 90s, before he moved over to facilities management at the high school. He'd heard through someone at the property company. "Heard you're between places," the message said. "I've got a room above the garage. Separate entrance. It's yours if you want it." I stared at the message for a long time. I texted back, "Don't want to put you out." He called instead. "Owen," he said, "you helped me re-roof that garage the year my wife was sick and you never asked for a dime. Get over here." I drove over that night. The room above the garage was small but clean. A twin bed, a space heater, a mini fridge, a window that looked out over the backyard. Grady's wife, Fern, had put a quilt on the bed and left a plate of cornbread on the counter. I stood in that room for a minute and felt my shoulders drop about 2 inches. That night, lying there in the dark, I let myself say the thing I'd been pushing aside. This wasn't a rough patch. Paulette hadn't asked me to cool down. She had made a choice, and the choice wasn't me. I thought about what would happen next. I thought about Denny in my kitchen, using my tools, sleeping in the house I'd helped pay for. I thought about the way Paulette's expression hadn't wavered when I picked up that box. And I thought about something else. If I disappeared quietly, someone was going to write the story of why, and they weren't going to be careful about it. I found out soon enough that I was right. About a week after I moved into Grady's garage, I got a text from my cousin Vera, who lived about 40 minutes south and who I talked to maybe 4 times a year. "Hey," she wrote, "heard you and Paulette are taking some time. You doing okay?" Taking some time. 2 words that meant something else entirely. I wrote back, "Where did you hear that?" She said, "Ran into her at the grocery store. She said you needed space to work through some things, that it was a mutual decision." I sat with that for a moment. Mutual. Like we'd sat down with a legal pad and divided up the weeks. Like I hadn't been standing in the driveway with a cardboard box and no plan while our brother watched from the doorway. I typed, "It wasn't mutual. I didn't choose to leave." Vera responded with a long pause and then, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know." But by then the version was already out there. Compact, clean, easy to believe. Owen needed space. Owen's working through something. Owen decided. No mention of the torque wrench left in the rain. No mention of the torque wrench left in the rain. No mention of the temperature. I started seeing the rest of it over the following weeks. A neighbor I'd known for 9 years stopped me at the gas station and said he heard I was doing some traveling, that Paulette had mentioned I'd been wanting to spend time with family out west. Traveling. My daughter-in-law, Theo's wife, sent a careful little text saying she hoped I was enjoying Oregon, which I had never once mentioned visiting. Paulette wasn't lying exactly. She was curating. She was building a story where nobody had done anything wrong, where I had simply drifted in a natural direction, and where she and Denny were just living their lives in a house that happened to have my tools in the garage. I didn't correct most of it. Not yet. What I did instead was start writing it down. Every night in that room above Grady's garage, I sat at the small table under the window and typed out what had actually happened. Just the sequence. The kitchen table conversation. The cardboard box. The church parking lot. Adele Marsh with the key and the thermos. The bank. The texts. Vera's message. The neighbor at the gas station. I wrote it plain. No embellishment, no score settling. Just what happened, in order, with dates. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it. In the meantime, I worked. The property company kept me busy enough. I fixed things. A furnace in a rental unit on Elm, a leaking pipe fitting in a commercial laundry, a set of gutters pulling away from a fascia board on a fourplex that nobody had looked at in 3 years. Practical work. Work that tells you the truth. One afternoon in late January, the property manager, a woman named Dette who had known me for years, mentioned that the Veterans Center on Madison Street was looking for someone to help with maintenance on a volunteer basis. They had a wood shop in the back that hadn't been used in 2 years. Equipment still there, just gathering dust. I drove by the next day. The building was brick. Low, solid. A sign out front said Ridgeline Veterans Resource Center. Inside, a man in his 70s named Ed Calloway ran the front desk. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam and had a handshake like a hydraulic press. I told him I was retired county, that I had time, that I knew my way around a shop. He looked me over carefully. "You a vet?" "Army," I said. 3 years, early 80s. "Nothing dramatic. Plenty dramatic enough," he said. He walked me back to the wood shop, workbench, table saw, lathe, router table, pegboard wall. Dust on everything. Smelled like cedar and old oil. I said, "I could clean this up." He said, "What would you do with it after?" I thought for a moment. I said, "I know a few guys who've lost their bearings. Could use something to make with their hands." He looked at me a long time. Then he said, "You've got the room. Don't burn it down." I spent the first 2 Saturdays just cleaning. Swept out the sawdust, wiped down the equipment, replaced a broken blade guard on the table saw. The 3rd Saturday, 4 men showed up. Grady came, an older man named Stu who'd worked the quarry north of town for 30 years until his knees gave out. A quiet widower named Perry, who Adele from St. Ambrose had mentioned the shop to, and Ed himself, who sat in the corner on a stool and claimed he was just observing. We started with simple joints: how to cut a clean dado, how to square a frame, how to read the grain of the wood before you make the first cut. Nobody asked why I was doing it. That was the good kind of silence. The group grew. 4 became 9. 9 became 15. We built a set of bookshelves for the Veterans Center Library. We built a ramp for an older man on Prospect Street who needed wheelchair access to his back door. We built a set of raised garden beds for a widow named Clara who couldn't kneel anymore but still wanted to grow tomatoes. One evening, Ed handed me a printout from the regional paper, page 6, bottom half. A short article about volunteer programs in the county. There was a photo of the shop, of me standing at the bench explaining how to cut a bridle joint. The caption read, "Local retiree opens woodshop program for veterans and seniors." I looked at it for a long time. I hadn't set out to build something. I'd set out to survive a winter. But there it was in print. My hands, the workbench, the men around me. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I didn't know yet that someone else would eventually see it. But they would. 3.5 years is long enough for a wound to stop being open and start being a scar. Long enough for a man to stop flinching every time he drives past a certain street. Long enough, apparently, for a woman to decide that what she had built in the meantime was worth presenting to the man she had put out in the cold. By that point, the wood shop at Ridgeline had a waiting list. We met twice a week. We'd finished 12 community projects. A reporter from the city paper had come out in the spring and done a longer piece with photos. The headline read, "From Retirement to Rebuilding. One Man's Quiet Impact." It ran on a Sunday. By Tuesday, I had a message I hadn't expected. It came through email, not text. A formal distance, which told me something. "Owen, I saw the article about your workshop. I always knew you were someone who needed to give back. It looks like the time apart gave you room to find that. Denny and I were talking about you just last week. I hope you're well. Paulette." I read it twice. I always knew you were someone who needed to give back. I sat with that sentence. Knowing requires paying attention. Attention had not been something in abundant supply the night I carried a cardboard box to my truck. And the time apart, as if we had agreed to pause, like a television series on hiatus. I didn't answer. Not that day. 2 days later, another message. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. Things with Denny have been complicated. I know I made choices that hurt you. I'm not sure I understood at the time how much. I hope someday we can talk." I showed it to Grady. I'd moved into my own apartment by then, 1 bedroom above a dry cleaner on North Halsted, nothing fancy but mine. And Grady had come over to help me build a proper workbench for the spare room. We were drinking coffee over it when I showed him my phone. He read it and set the phone back on the table. "She waited until there was a newspaper article," he said. "I know. That's not an accident. I know that too." I didn't want to believe that was the whole story. People can feel more than one thing. She could be both calculating and genuinely regretful. But I knew enough to be careful. A week after that, Grady's wife, Fern, mentioned that Paulette had shared the newspaper article on Facebook. I didn't have Facebook anymore, hadn't for 2 years, but Fern showed me on her phone. The caption Paulette had written read, "So glad to see Owen doing such meaningful work. He always had so much to offer. Proud of him. Proud of him." I had slept in a church storage room. I'd moved my savings quietly so I wouldn't be left with nothing. I'd spent 3.5 years building something from a cold start, and now I was being publicly claimed, like a project someone had always believed in. The comments were kind to her. "What a beautiful friendship you two have. You can really see the respect there. Love seeing this kind of support." I handed the phone back to Fern. I called my son that evening. "She reached out," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Of course she did. The article gave her cover. "I don't know if it's that simple. It might not be all of it," he said, "but it's some of it. I pulled out the folder I'd kept in my file cabinet since that first winter, the one I'd labeled November. Inside, a printout of the text Paulette sent the morning after I left. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. Danny just needs some stability, and I think some space will help everyone. A copy of the joint account statement showing a significant charge the week after I left that she hadn't mentioned, and a short video clip. I'd installed a doorbell camera the previous spring, the kind that uploads to a cloud account registered to your email address. When Paulette changed the house Wi-Fi password, the camera stopped getting live access. But the clips from the previous 48 hours was still in the cloud. One of them was timestamped 9:17 p.m. on a Wednesday in November. You could see the porch. The front door open. Paulette in the doorway. Me below, on the step, holding the box. Her voice, clear. Owen, I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while. Denny needs stability, and honestly, so do I. No anger, no raised voices, no ambiguity. Just a door, and a man with a box, and a woman making a quiet choice. I had kept it for the same reason I had kept everything else. Not revenge. Memory insurance. Because trauma doesn't hold its shape, it blurs itself to protect you, and then you start to wonder if you imagined the worst of it. I opened a new email. I typed for about 20 minutes. I wrote the sequence the same way I had written it in the garage room 3 years ago, plain and in order. The table conversation, the box, the parking lot, the bank, the text from Vera, the neighbor at the gas station who thought I was in Oregon. Then I added, you said you always knew I had something to offer. Knowing requires presence. You were not present the night I slept in a parking lot. You were not present when I moved my savings to protect myself. You were not present when I knowed from St. Louis. Ambrose gave a stranger a key because it was cold, so I'd ask that you not claim a version of me you didn't witness. I attached the bank statement. I attached the video clip. I hit send at 11:09 p.m. Then I sat in the quiet of the apartment and waited for nothing in particular. My phone rang at 7:40 the next morning. Paulette. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. She didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice had less architecture to it than usual, like she'd taken something down. I didn't know you still had the camera footage, she said. That's not the point, I said. I know, she exhaled. I didn't realize I was doing it. The rewriting. You knew you were doing something. Yes, I thought if I kept it simple it would hurt less. For everyone. For who? I asked. I had slept in a parking lot. I had driven to a church and taken a key from a woman I didn't know. I had moved money in the dark of a Tuesday morning because I was afraid of being cut off. None of that was simple. She was quiet. Then she said, Denny's gone, for what it's worth. He left about 8 months ago. Things got worse before they got better with him. I didn't say I told you so. It wasn't the point. What happened to him, I asked. Because I was still human. He's living with a friend in Raleigh, she said. He's got a job. I think he'll be okay. And you? I asked. She paused. I'm okay. I'm alone, but I'm okay. I nodded to myself. That's something, I said. Owen. She said my name carefully. I told people you left because it was easier than saying I asked you to go. I know. I didn't think you'd struggle. I thought you were the kind of person who just keeps going. I am the kind of person who keeps going, I said. That's not the same as not hurting. She didn't answer for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not for any of the reasons I'd been saying privately. I'm sorry because what I did was wrong. The simplicity of that landed differently than anything else she'd said. No buffer, no context, no qualifier. I'm not looking to go backward, I said. But I appreciate you saying that. I know. She said it quietly. I know you're not. The call ended without resolution and without explosion. Just an acknowledgement that something real had happened, that it had cost something, and that the cost was not nothing. I drove to the shop that morning and stood in the center of the room for a while before anyone else arrived. Ran my hand along the edge of the main bench. The wood was scarred from 3 years of use, burns from a heat gun, nicks from a plain blade, one long gouge where Stu had slipped with a chisel and never quite forgiven himself. The surface was imperfect and solid in the way that used things get to be. A week later, Vera sent me a message. "Heard things with Paulette have gotten quiet," she wrote. "Everything okay?" I thought about how to answer that. Then I typed, "It's honest now." That's enough. That Sunday I drove past the old house. I didn't slow down. The deck was still there. The boards had grayed some from the weather, but they were solid. I'd used deck screws rated for 30 years, and I'd torqued them right, and they weren't going anywhere. Things I build tend to last. I still have the Silverado. I got the rear tire fixed. Turned out it was the valve stem, a $5 repair I'd been putting off for months. I laugh at myself about that sometimes. Sleeping in a parking lot, but too stubborn to deal with a slow leak. On some mornings before I head to the shop, I sit in the truck for a few minutes with the engine off. I'm not being sentimental about it. I just remember what it felt like that first night. The quiet, the cold, the parking lot lights, the absolute silence of no one checking on you. I remember that man. I want to keep remembering him because he did something I didn't know he could do. He started over at 61, without permission, without applause, without anyone watching. I don't tell this story so you'll think badly of Paulette. She was afraid of losing her brother, and she made choices that came from fear, and fear makes people smaller than they usually are. I understand that now. Understand it now. Understanding is an absolution, but it's better than carrying the full weight of someone else's failure. What I'll tell you is this. You can be 61 years old with a cardboard box and the slow tire leak and no plan and still build something that matters. You can lose the house and keep the truth. You can be erased from someone's version of events and still exist completely in your own. Capability isn't the same as not deserving kindness. Strength isn't the same as not needing to be treated with fairness. And forgiveness, when it comes, doesn't arrive because you demanded it. It arrives because you built something solid enough that the truth had somewhere to stand. I was never the problem. It took me a while to stop acting like I might be. If this story found you somewhere you recognize, if you've ever been handed a box and told it was for the best, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you held on to. We put out new stories every week. Stories about men who kept going when keeping going was the only option they had left. Subscribe if you want to keep walking this road. And remember one thing, just one. The quiet ones are still out here, and we are still building.